Hi, today I want to show you how you can make dynamic selector inputs, dynamic dropdowns inside of Toddle that are populated from data that comes from your database. And it is super simple and you can do it without writing any code. And of course, we're going to use for our backend the only enterprise grade full solution no-code backend that does it all: APIs, databases, logic. I'm talking about Xano. So we're going to use Toddle for our front end, Xano for the backend part. So I'm going to walk you through how to set that up. So let's first, how about we start getting some of the data inside of Toddle. So let's get right started. So right now I'm in Toddle and we want to get data in. But before we get data in, we need data. So if I go in my Xano database, I created a super simple database with names and values in here. And now how about we duplicate this tab in Xano, and we're going to go to probably the most important feature in Xano called API. You know, their database is brilliant, it's super easy to use, but what you're really paying for with Xano are the APIs. So let's go to my test endpoint because I got quite a few in here. Where's my test endpoint? Here we go. Just like ignore the DDoS attack endpoint I have in here. This was someone in office hours. He was building like a crypto app, and we were checking if I managed. So like we kind of like made a little bet if I managed to hack into his app from Xano, and I actually built an endpoint in Xano that created a bunch of fake accounts in his app. This is ethical hacking, right? Because like I asked him for his permission, and he was okay with it, and we showed up a lot of vulnerabilities that his Xano setup had, and he was able to add middleware in there, and we were able to introduce middleware into that to protect it from those attacks. So I should probably delete that because this thing is a little bit too powerful to be in my possession, you know, or shown on YouTube. But let's go on custom endpoint real quick, and let's go in here and let's call this options. Those are the options for our endpoint. We'll make a get API. We'll save this. And here we go. And now we don't need to add an input, but I'm going to add a function. And in Xano, the cool thing is the function stack is where you do your logic. So we add a function and we look for query all records in database requests. And I'm going to go to my select options. I'm going to save this. And now when I run this endpoint, I'm going to get all my options sent to the front end. Now we're going to publish that endpoint. And when I copy this endpoint URL and were to open this in the browser, I would get that payload back because it is not authenticated, and that's completely fine. So now we want to go to Toddle and we want to have Toddle do exactly what the browser did. Call this data source. The way we call data sources inside of Toddle, and actually, let me do a little visualization of, you know, how we get data inside of Toddle. How about I add a text input in here? And I'm going to show you how that will work. So just disregard the text input for now. This will be important in a second. Now we click outside of the canvas, so we get this option of APIs, and I click on the plus, and now we're going to connect it to a data source. And I think it's very cool that Toddle always shows that I'm in Glendale every time I open the editor. So let's turn off auto fetch for now, because we don't want to trigger the API all the time. I mean, you know, with get auto fetch is cool, but sometimes, you know, generally turn auto fetch off while you do settings because you're making a bunch of API calls. So let's call this options. And now in the URL here, I'm going to add the URL of my data source. We don't have any inputs in here, right? So we don't need to set anything for the queries or for the body. We can ignore that. And it's a get, so it won't even have a body. So we have a get endpoint, and that should be it. We don't have any authorization. If you have protected data, you want to make it authenticated, and that's something that we talk about in the courses at nocodeprocode.com. So if you want to learn more, it's the best place to learn and build faster in Toddle and Xano. But let's make this auto fetch. So we're loading it server side, and you see we're getting the data here, right? So this data is now loaded by Toddle. And what I could do is I could go on FX on this text, and I could go on options, and I could go on data. And now it's going to say object, object, object. So I write JSON to make it visible, and I probably want to do not JSON parse. So let's do JSON. Here we go. Encode JSON. So I can visualize the data on the DOM. DOM is the elements. We call this DOM, right? So the idea is if you open the page, you see the moment the page loads, the data is already on there. Because what having auto fetch on is rendering this server side. So this is what's very important when you want to have great SEO. And we could even make a little test of it. Of course, you know, it'll be some kind of test because we're going to get a lot of things back. But let me show you what it means to have the server side rendered. Inside of Xano, and you don't have to do this, let's call this scraper. Let's make like a simple web scraper inside of Xano, and that's how powerful Xano is. Let's make an external API call, and I just want to show you that Toddle is doing server-side rendering if you have auto fetch on. Now, if we reload this, I'm going to get a bunch of payload back, right? So let's expand this. Here we go. And what are we looking for? We are looking for, let's look for Claude AI. So let's copy this. And I go in my payload in Xano, I do Command F, and I'm looking for Claude AI. And as you can see, I'm getting Claude AI in the payload that a web scraper such as this would call. And this is what you need for great SEO in combination with the dynamic sitemap XML, which we have templates for in the membership side. But this is what tools like Wist or MemberStack are not doing. Toddle is doing that for you. Or Bubble is, I think, also not server-side rendered. And WeWeb is not server-side rendered for dynamic pages that come from Xano. Toddle is one of the only no-code tools that has true server-side rendering for dynamic page generation, for dynamic pages, which is pretty unique in the industry. And we got it here. You see, this is what a web scraper would get, and they would know, hey, your website talks about Claude AI. Let's put your first search result. And the cool thing is you don't have any CMS limits by doing that. But I'm going off topic here. This is just good to know. So we got that here, but now we don't really need that text because we're trying to render a dynamic dropdown. So let's build the dropdown. And this requires a little bit of HTML, but it's fun. So let's start adding a div block. I like to add a div block first so that I can style it to my liking. So let's make this div block first in here. And let's make this div block 10 rem. And let's make the height 2 rem. So I got a nice drop down. Let's make the background gray 50. Let's make the border 10. Let's give it a border radius of, let's give it a border width of 1 pixel and a border color of gray 200. This is, by the way, why all my designs always look the same. And we go in here and we make sure that the text color is gray 700, that it inherits it. And now in here, I'm going to add another div, and this div will not stay a div. I'm going to go here on the attributes, and I'm going to turn this div into a select field, right? And now we see we got the dropdown because we got a select field. Now it's all kind of like interesting formatted, but we don't have to worry about it yet. So we got the select input here, and inside of the select input, I want to add another div where we need to go to the attributes and change its tag to be option. And now we got an option in here. And inside of this option, we're going to add text of option 1. And now we're going to make it look beautiful. So let's first go to the div holding the select input. And in here, how about we add 0.5 rem padding, or actually we should add the padding on the input. So, and we could actually even take this and make this a label technically, right? So we could do label. I think making this a label will be even better, because even if the select input would be that small, we could go on the select inputs on attributes and give it an ID of select1, for example. And we go on the label and we add an attribute for select1. And when I click outside of it, it should still call it. I mean, this is probably just like for design best practices, and not severely needed though. So let's go in here. Let's go to the label, or actually let's change it back to a div. We don't need to be too best practices here. And let's give it 0.5. No, I want to only have the right side, because the thing is, if we zoom in here a little bit, if I go into the select, if I were to give the select a side padding of 1 rem, only this would have 1 rem. This dropdown would not have 1 rem on the side. So the idea is, if I want to give it 0.25 rem side padding, or 0.25 rem, to have it like a little space in there, this would not move. This would be very close to the side. So this is why we wrap it in a div, and the styling for the dropdown will be applied on the div. So I can go on the div and only make the right side 0.25 rem. Oh, that's the wrong side. And only make the right side 0.25 rem. So it moves this select a little bit to the side so it's aligned properly. And now I can go in this div block and I can go on font size and make it 14. So that looks beautiful. And then in here on this div, I'm going to make top and bottom 0.25 rem as well, and bottom 0.25 rem. I probably, for best practices, so the select option is as big as possible, I should probably apply it on the select option, so 0.25 rem. So we want this select field to be as big as possible, because this is where the user will be clicking on in order to get that view. And then in here, the one holding it, we can remove the height, so it will automatically adapt. And now we got a select input working. And now it's not dynamic yet, but we got a select input. As you can see here, I can click and select options. Now, there is one more thing I want to make sure that we have set up, is the first one should just say select option or select name or something like that. So the person interacting with it knows that this is where they can select it. And the option generally should have, let's go to attributes and let's give it a value attribute of 0, just like that. Now, what we're going to do in the select input here, we give it an option value 0, and now we're going to add another option in the select input, and this will be that we will be rendering dynamically. So let's go to this option here, and let's go on repeat, and we're going to render it from the data coming from options. We get our array in here. So now we see we got a bunch of select options, so we need to change their value and their text. First of all, inside of the dynamic option item, let's go on fx in the option text, and we go on item, and we go on name. That's how we're going to get the names in here. Now, if I click them, they would all set a value of 0. We're not seeing it yet, but they would. So let's go on option, and let's go on our value attribute, and let's go on fx, and let's make this dynamic based on the item, and let's look for the item value. Here we go. Now, if I select, I can select things. But how do we get the value that is currently selected? So how about we go on the select input and we add an event, and we add a click event in here, and we're going to add a log to console, and let's call this I clicked or I selected, and now we're going to go to data, and we're going to go to event, and I just want to log the whole event data, and it's probably actually not on click. And let's go on the select. It should probably be on, I assume, on input. Let's try on input, right? Let's call this I inputted. Let's log that event, the whole event. So event on input, I inputted. And then let's add also on change, let's add a log to console, and let's call it I changed. And then we're going to also make this event data so that we're logging change and input. So now we can see which one works better for our use case and which one is the value we want to look at. So let's clear our console. So what we do is we two-finger click, we go to inspect elements, and we're going to go on console, we clear the console, we go on play in Toddle, we clear the error messages, and now let's select ChatGPT. So we get some data. We get data I inputted and I changed. I inputted is going to give us some data, as you can see. I can see is trusted, and I see source element. We probably want to expand on target, right? And inside of target, we should have value somewhere. And we're getting a bunch of data. So let's look at, it's a lot of data, type input. Let's go Command F and let's look for value. And let's go through the console. Let's see where we have values in here. And we see class list. Let's look for value, node value. Let's see. Let's look on change. And let's expand that. Let's expand target. Right? Here we go. We get a bunch of data. I can tell you it should be target value, but the idea is you get things logged to the console. Now, this is probably not helping us much, but you know, there is data behind it. We just know that the change and input both contain data that is interesting for us. So let's try looking at change target value. That's generally what we would be doing. And let's look at input target value. And let's log that to the console and let's see if they both provide us sufficient information. So let's go to the console. Let's close the console and let's select Claude. And we see both return Claude AI. So at this point, we can choose which event we want to do. They both do the same. I like using input because it is more reactive, right? Like, generally speaking, it's a little bit better than change. Change means if you click outside of it, if it was changed, if, you know, they follow through with it. I like to use input, but at selectors, there's no big difference. So now we know, okay, when I go in this selector, let's go and inspect elements again, and I select something, I get this logged to the console. I can get the selected value, ChatGPT, right in here. So this is great. And we get event data, right? We get event data. Now, how do we set a variable with this? So first of all, in order to set a variable, we need to create a variable. So let's call this selector value, and the value will be, the initial value will be 0. So we will say select option. Now, if I go to the selector, there is no bind to variable option for the select input, right? So what we need to do is we need to set this up manually, and let's do this. So we're copying. The cool thing in Toddle is you click on the event, you two-finger click, you go on copy. Now we can delete our console log. So on input, we are setting the variable with the event data for event target value. Boom. And now under here, this is how I like to debug. Let's add text. Double click in the text. Inside of the text field, you go on FX, and we're binding it to the variable. Right now, this is saying 0. If I click on flux1, it's going to say flux1. If I click on hyperbolic, it's going to say hyperbolic. If I click on ChatGPT, it's going to say ChatGPT. So we're setting the variable properly. Now, what if the variable's initial value is ChatGPT, and did that spelled correctly, right? ChatGPT, yes. And I reload the page, and it's, you know, It's not saying ChatGPT. So what are we doing now? And here's what we're doing. It's very cool the way Toddle handles it. Let's look at our dynamic option first, and let's proceed with this in the dynamic option, right? So let's go to the dynamic option. Let's go to attributes, and we're adding an attribute. So we're clicking on plus, and we call the attribute selected. We're using the selected attribute. And in Toddle, if it's true or false, we can dynamically set the attribute. So we're going to go on FX, and we're going to look for item value equals the selector value. If the item value, currently ChatGPT, equals the saved variable selector value ChatGPT, it will output true, and ChatGPT, so the object, the option with the value of ChatGPT will be selected, right? So now we got this selected, right? If I now were to go into the variable manually and change it to Claude AI, it will change it to Claude, as you can see. Now, what happens though if I change it to the hard-coded version? So if I make this 0 by default, it's automatically going to select options because all of them will be false and will default to the first one. Now, having it default to the first one is one way. It's probably not the most sophisticated approach you can take. Let me show you how to make it a little bit more sophisticated. On this option, we're going to add another selected attribute. We're going to go on FX, and we're going to take selector value equals 0, because we know that this is the 0 value. And then you can add additional logic on your backend to not accept any API requests that have a 0 in the specific value and say, no, 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 we don't do this. Sorry. This is how you would also do that in most of the things in the web. So now, when we reload our page, we see we got it at 0. It's starting at 0, right? And if I were to select something in here, the variable is updating based on the dynamic options that are being pulled from my database. Now, we can do this even cooler because we could even save the selection data in case they don't want to submit the form yet locally on the user's machine, so they can continue their selection. This is why we already set up the selected attribute. So let me show you how to do that. So what you're going to do, we're going to do one more step. On the select event on input, after we set the selector value, we're going to look for save to local storage. The key will be, we can call this selector value, and the value of this will be our current value of the selector value attribute. So we're saving it using this function on the machine, on the user's machine. That's all we need to do. And then, right now, we're saving it on the machine. And let's just do another experiment because I want to show you this. We save it on the machine. And now in here, this input, the one under it, right, in here, would do the formula get from local storage, and it would get the value with selector value. So now if I set this to be Dolly, and now I would reload the page, it would say Dolly, even though this is not set to Dolly yet, right? If I say this to hyperbolic, this is the current variable that was immediately selected. And now we saved hyperbolic on local storage. And now if I reload, the second text should say hyperbolic, because now on reload, it's pulling it from local storage. Now we want though to update the selected option here. So we could create like a cycle. So we create a life cycle on load. We're going to set the selector variable, and we're going to go on FX because we're setting it dynamically. And we're looking for get from local storage, and we're getting the value from the local storage. The same thing that we would do in here to set this text. So now we can delete this. And now, if I set this to Dolly, it's immediately set to Dolly. if I reload the page, right, it's still set to Dolly, as you can see, as it will be pulled from local storage. It may take a little bit because it makes an API call and it's trying to retrieve something from local storage. But as you can see, the progress of that form will be maintained as it is pulling it from local storage. So now we can delete our little helper text, and we got this beautiful selector that updates the variable, and even its progress is maintained and saved. So we selected ChatGPT, it will say ChatGPT, and the variable saved already has the current value of ChatGPT, so people can proceed with their form submissions in this selector input. And this is the high level and the detailed overview, a little crash course on how to make selectors work dynamically inside of Toddle, and they work great with dynamic data. If you want to learn more about those things and become a better Toddle developer, I would highly suggest you to look into the NoCode ProCode membership. You're going to get access to Toddle templates and boilerplates, dozens of hours of step-by-step courses for Toddle, a whole component library, daily support office hours from Monday to Friday. If you have any questions about any specific templates or need, any guidance on how to implement the specific template and so on, happy to help. We got pre-made Xano snippets, so you don't have to rebuild the database from scratch every time you start new projects. We got boilerplates for that, for the most important things, from web scrapers to authentication to OTP to everything, AI, voiceover generation, everything. And we got exclusive private tutorials that really focus on edge cases, like how to add SMS auth. We're not talking about that in YouTube. We don't have the time for that, but we have the time for that in the membership side. And people really love it. Lee loves it. He's an agency owner. Greg loves it. He's a Webflow developer. Leonard loves it. He's probably building the most controversial Toddle app ever, probably so far, and he shipped it 50% faster. So, everybody loves it. Even Web3 developers love it. Look at that, right? That was actually the one I did the ethical hacking on in office hours to just show him some of the vulnerabilities, and then he used the template for authentication to make it secure, because my templates are great. They're all authenticated. You should not build the authentication yourself. Use the templates we have on the community to make sure it's always safe. But yeah, if you want to join, you click on Get Access Now. You make a little video, talk about yourself, how we can help you. And then, if we can help you, if you, for example, want to join because you have questions in Bubble, we'll probably say, no, we don't do Bubble. But, if you try to migrate from Bubble to Toddle, our content is beneficial, will help you. Hey. And then we'll send you the link to join. It's just that we had some people join with the wrong tech stack, and we just want to make sure that everybody gets a great value out of that. Even if you want to join with Wiz, we have still a bunch of content, and we'll maintain everything that's on there. So we still have a bunch of value for you, even if you're using Wiz. Right now we're moving forward with Toddle and Xano. Doesn't mean that we won't have valuable things for you in Wist, as you can condense Toddle and Xano into a Wist or Webflow application. Even if you use Webflow memberships, I've had someone who built something in Webflow memberships, and I built for him a Toddle component that he was able to introduce inside of his site using Webflow memberships, because we figured out, and I didn't know that, I turned so many clients down telling them I don't touch Webflow memberships. But I found actually out with that, it was a few days ago, we can build a Toddle web component, we can add it into the site with Webflow memberships, and over the window that Webflow adds on the page, we're able to retrieve the membership information, validate if they are a member, and then have this widget built in Toddle to add an AI chatbot inside of their Webflow memberships site that was built in Webflow memberships with things they could normally not do in Webflow memberships, and Wiz couldn't do because Wiz doesn't integrate natively with Webflow memberships. They only integrate with MemberStack. So we were able to use Toddle to make the impossible possible, even that they're using Webflow memberships, because they were very concerned about server-side rendering, their protected content and pages. So that's working great, and people who don't pay can't use it because of the window data, and then they use the Webflow API to validate if the window data is true. We built that in Toddle, so even if you use Webflow, Toddle is a very valuable tool because you can condense those web components in there. We even made Toddle components that use Toddle and Xano talk with the Wist JavaScript library and the Wist object, and even get some data from the Wist config files, which was also pretty cool. So you can condense Toddle into everything. This is why we rebranded from the place to help you with NoCode to help you with Toddle and Xano, because you could even add Toddle web components inside of Bubble apps, inside of everything. So if this triggers your interest, make a little submission video. I would love to see you inside of the e-learning platform, to have you part of the membership. Thank you so much for watching this video. And if you want to join, can't wait to see you on the inside. See you probably tomorrow. But you know, regardless on if you join or not, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was very educational and very beneficial to you, and a blessing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.